Um, I live in a village in Hong Kong, so actually there are more people here than in my village. Thank you for inviting me, and I very much like the idea that this is a working session rather than something to present answers, because I don't know the answers. And also I should say I'm an artist who work with plants. So I haven't worked in an ethnographic museum. I hope this is relevant. Okay. So the lesson that I'm sure everyone knows this already, the lesson that the virus has taught us is that we cannot live in the fantasy that we own this planet. We account for only 0.01% of the total biomass on this planet. We have to collaborate with other beings, whether we like it or not. This, to me, includes addressing the planetary ecological meltdown. I think it's still incredible that we still imagine that we can address this crisis alone, not working with others. But as artists, I also think about what does this mean to what I do. So this is what I will share a little bit of the thinking. I think this also requires us to find a new definition for art. So I started to work with plants about a decade ago. And people often ask me why I suddenly decided to migrate from working with communities, what's called socially engaged art, to working with plants, to think about ecological situation. My honest reply was, it wasn't decided by me. It's this patch of weeds on the former site of the Shanghai cement factory, now known as the West Bund, the art district in Shanghai, that woke me up in the summer of 2013. I was invited to do something there, and then I saw this patch of weeds, which completely surprised me in the middle of the city. So plants, insects, and soil called me into action, into claiming the site as my artwork, so that I would not be bulldozed and paved over to become a plaza for human-only concerts. Because the city was transforming this area into the cultural district, and then the plan was to get rid of the weeds and make it into a concrete plaza. So this became my project, a found botanical garden. Since then, for every project, I claim only half the credit, the other half belongs to plants and their friends. They sculpt and play so I can live and breathe. Many of us in the art world have long abandoned the genius trope invented by the 16th century writer Giorgio Vasari, who created this myth of artistic genius. I think now it's time for one step further to abandon the creationist myth of art making. So the title still uses create, but I don't think we should use create. We're not created by God, and we do not create like God. Without trees, spiders, whales, we will never be able to make art. We are inspired by patterns, stories, and philosophical ideas that originate in the complex and beautiful web of life on this planet. In 2016, a botanist took me to a forest on the edge of Taipei. This is a picture of that forest, where scientists like him study ferns. I won't go into the colonial history, but if people, I can talk about it later in relation to the conference. This is in Taiwan. Since then, I've been going there every year to work on a eco-sexual film. Basically, guys having sex with ferns. I look forward to this. I'm a bit nervous, so that's why it sounds very serious, but it's really having sex, okay? I look forward to this annual ritual because the air in the forest is so invigorating. As artists, we usually don't get up very early. But to make this film in the forest, because of the particular geography and lighting, etc., we really have to be there right at sunrise. So usually we're half awake. But once in the forest, bathing in the sea of oxygen and phytoncides, our bodies and minds reach a heightened level of agility and attentiveness. Plants reveal to us the full potential of a three-dimensional space. So here you see the massive bird's nest ferns perch on trees. Tiny moss blanket rocks, the light is dramatic, the aroma intense. The forest is better than any artwork that I, a tiny human, could ever make, and better than any exhibition I've ever seen. So this ecosexual film titled Teratophilia portrays intimate relations between humans and ferns. So I don't know now, I honestly don't know how I came up with this idea. But I would remember it was very difficult to explain to other people until the first part of the film was made. But then 3 years ago, I was on YouTube and then I saw this video. I'm not playing the video, just a picture, shot in New South Wales by ecologist Colin Bauer, showing a wasp on the left, often called the orchid dupe wasp. The Latin name is there. Basically humping a tongue orchid. So this is it's possible to see in Australia and Italy. So I thought, oh wow, this is just like my film. Or more accurately, my film is just like this phenomenon in so-called nature. So this is called pseudocopulation by human scientists. So in both instances, we see a sort of animal and a plant entangled in interspecies sexual relations. So the most imaginative idea in my whole artistic career turned out to be nothing original. I was basically following orchids and wasps. So we don't stand on the shoulder of giants, but in billions of years of evolution. So being outrun by flowers and insects does not mean that we should give up and do nothing. So conservation scientists have often shown that human participation, when practiced wisely, can contribute to biodiversity. A 2019 study concludes that areas managed by indigenous communities in Australia, Brazil, and Canada have similar levels of vertebrate biodiversity to that of nature reserves. It depends on whether we work with other beings in the planetary garden or exploit them until we all drop dead in the capitalist market. So coming back to what I'm thinking as artists, I think I hope in a few years, textbooks will change so that art is not defined as human creativity, but as more than human vibrancy. So I'm using the word Wanwu here, a Taoist term. Literal meaning is 10,000 things, but it can be better translated as myriad happenings. I was in this part of the planet. I was the artist in residence at the Gropiusbau. This is a building in Berlin, art exhibition space. So last year I had, working with others to stage this exhibition called Wanwu Council. So again, the idea of Wanwu is basically things between heaven and earth. So it included a few projects, but I'll talk about mainly the workshop. So it had drawings I've done on my daily walks with plants and a film called The Political Life of Plants in a Forest outside of Berlin. But more importantly, as most people in Berlin know this institution as this building, I thought it was really important to change that imagination because there are 100 trees living right outside the building. So this is a picture. My studio was on the top floor of the building. Then when I look out the window, I see these 100 plane trees in the middle of the city. But most people, when they come to Gropius Bao, they go into the building, leave, and never walk around. Except when people drive to that institution, they park their cars there. So this is known as a parking lot, not as a forest. So the first thing we did was to give it a name, because naming is so important. So we changed the name to Gropius Hain, Gropius Wood, for people to refer it as the Gropius Wood. And then we took over a bay of the parking lot. We couldn't get permission to use the whole parking lot, but we took over one bay of the parking lot. We built a simple platform for people to come with me to do what I call eco-sensibility exercises, to bring people to this part of the institution and also to work with trees, to do qigong, to do drawing, to do the maple dance, to sing Stand By Me with the trees. The other thing we did was to organize a Wanwu council. I still, like I said, this is just sharing some ideas. I'm very much look forward to talking to you actually, to think together, because we're thinking, how do we really bring modern human into the institution? So it wasn't done really, so we just invited people who would channel different beings. So we had scientists who studied microbes, who would channel the microbes. We had the founder of the Princessa Garden to channel soil. We had Mari artists from Russia who channel foxes. So we had 12 people channeling different beings to form this first Wanwu Council. The key question for us was, how can an art institution like the Gropius Bao move towards a modern human future? We were in the building, and then we were also in the forest. This is the beech forest in Gromzin, which is a beech forest from the last ice age. And we only imagined, we haven't started doing, we only imagined we come up with 4 manifesto and then combine them into one. So I'll just go through it. So we want to change the name Gropius Bao to Gropius Baum. For people who read German, I'm sure you understand the tree, right? So Gropius Bao, the building, the site, the community, the ecosystems have spoken. Learn from our scars, listen to what we have with. What have the humans been busy with? We challenge all beings to become Wanwu. We begin by planting the seed to be cared for by a collective so it can grow into a forest. We want Wanwu Council with power. A few things we want to start. 1, rename Gropius Bao to Gropius Baum. Recognize and mourn death, the death of oneself, of plants, animals, hopes, fears, the sun, the sky, and more. Mourn what has not been mourned, mourn the unmournable. 3, very concretely, start composting. 4, switch to an ethical bank. 5, Gropius Baum is already more than human. Communicate the presence of microbes, the Gropius Baum microbiome, by revealing the DNA and RNA sequences of the billions of microbes who live here. Plant a tree symbolic of the tree of life in the atrium with an opening in the ceiling to let rain come in. Unseal the ground outside and let nature regenerate itself. Let a succession of plants and soil and communities unfold. Use the stones dug out from the ground in the Gropius wood to build a nap room. For the workshop, we also had naps built in the workshop. I don't know if we're doing it here. And 9, include Gropius wood in all floor plans so that artists and visitors know that this community is part of the Gropius Baum site. Honor, respect, and protect Gropius wood as a person based on the principle of environmental personhood and rights of Mother Earth. Let light and darkness come into the atrium and all the rooms. I noticed the blinds here. Make Gropius bomb accessible to all. If there have to be tickets, allow visitors to pedal to generate electricity in exchange for admission. Reduce ecological footprints, achieve positive footprints. Make reparation to Mother Earth. Allow fluidity and natural cycles to occur in exhibitions. Let exhibitions adapt to local ecological conditions. Make growth and decay possible. We are fully aware that this runs counter to the current conservation paradigm of museums and exhibitions. Define Gropius bomb as an organic art form for art and crafts, for educating, repairing, gardening, nourishing, composting, and shamanic healing. Contribute to a diverse and equal planet. Heal from colonial and capitalist wounds. Recover our molecular memories that we are part of a continuously changing cycle of life. Celebrate life and renew. But like I said, this is really easy said than done. So I'm very happy to be here because I'm thinking, what could be the next step? Because I think to transform the definition of art, to really push art institutions to become more than human, probably will take 10, 20 years. Will take many of us and also our relations with plants and other forms of life and materialities. So I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
So thank you very much to the Taking Care organizational team for having me here today. I'm really, really happy to be here and to share this work with you. And before I start, I just want to note that at some point in my presentation, I will be talking about discussions concerning sexual assault and rape. So if you, for any reason, need to leave or would prefer not to be here for that, I completely understand. The de facto household of the Fort de Goede Hoop, built in the Cape, present-day Cape Town, South Africa, in 1652, serves as a marker of a false beginning of South African colonial history, a socially and politically uncertain period of encounter, conflict, and struggle. It is also a site of both myth-making and mystery, a place of myth as the start of a European engagement at the Cape, a contested region of colonial conquest since the 16th century, and perhaps more accurately, a place of mystery in that, despite first Cape Commander Jan van Riebeeck's diaries, the recorded letters to Amsterdam and Batavia, no one can know for certain what took place in those early years outside of a European perspective. These historical experiences are largely unrecoverable, as is the fort itself, as it was demolished in 1674 to make way for the Castle of Good Hope, which still stands today and operates as a museum. My interest lies in the early period of slavery at the Cape, a period contextualized by a developed Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie system of slavery in the Indian Ocean, and from here on I will refer to the company as the VOC, that encompass port towns and economies in regions across present-day southern India, Indonesia, Mozambique, Madagascar, and Mauritius, and linked to Atlantic slave trades through trade stemming from West African regions such as Angola and Guinea. Batavia in the East Indies was the primary seat of the VOC in the Indian Ocean, a well-established slave society that came to inform, in part, how slavery at the Cape functioned. Historian Robert Schell asserts that the domestic slave-owning household is a neglected scene in understanding the dynamics of interpersonal relations, power, and hierarchy during South Africa's early colonial period. And through a reading of the historiographic record in conjunction with a close attendance to questions of gender and social status, I am particularly interested in how these conditions of, quote, enforced proximity, to borrow the term from Kiguru Macharia, within slave-owning households produced the relationships that profoundly shaped South African society. And to these ends, I returned to the unclaimable lost space of the Fort de Goede Hoop to explore questions of family, households, and kinships within formally recognized formations and more imaginative, speculative possibilities, drawing upon the work of Saadia Hartman and her conceptions of critical fabulation, and Yvette Abrams' work of historical speculation. Giving focus to the domestic reality of the slave economy is a way for me to give specificity and a human face to a history of enslavement that is poorly understood among the South African public. For reasons I'm committed to uncovering, slavery, which existed in South Africa in some shape from 1654 to around 1808, is largely ignored within the narrative of the country's history, eclipsed by British colonialism in the 19th century and the more recent period of apartheid in the 20th century. Within the context of the fort, I'm specifically interested in the lives and stories of two people. Ansla van Bengalen, an enslaved woman brought to the Cape after being captured off the coast of Bengal in 1657, who in the literature has been referred to in any number of the following ways. And the other, Kritoa, also referred to as Efa, an indigenous woman of the Khoi clan, the Korengakona, who is described in any of the following ways. Both Ansla and Kritoa occupied space within the fort, roughly within the same period from 1657 into the 1660s. Both women, both who then were young women, young girls, lived in service to Commander Jan van Riebeeck at his family at various junctures of his 10-year tenure, and in the centuries following would be claimed by various groups as stammoeders or founding mothers of South African society. As Abrams states in the opening lines to her landmark paper, Was Efa Raped? An Exercise in Speculative History, I chose to work with Efa's story for a number of reasons. She was aptly first woman because her experience of colonialism was later to be repeated by thousands of Khoisan women. It seemed therefore appropriate to begin with her life. And I would like to note quite carefully here that I do not situate these two women together to draw direct points of comparison, but rather as an opportunity to explore the many concurrent social and legal statuses of women from different backgrounds, and to reveal the possibility of other modes of relational orientation beyond the interest or scope of the colonial diarist. In popular conceptions of South African history, of the two women, Kritoa is known as an important figure in indigenous history and is widely understood as a go-between the indigenous Khoi and the VOC delegation, owing to her depth skill with languages. And most recently, she was the subject of the full feature film Kritoa, directed by Roberta Durant, and recognized as central in a deeply fraught diplomatic conflict. Kritoa's story is frequently characterized as tragic. She is framed as a person who lived in between cultures and someone who was unable to cope with the shifting social circumstances of her life. And this mediation of her story has meant that Kritoa has been subjected to seemingly unending scrutiny, even in death. In contrast, Ansla van Bengalen's story is not widely known amongst the South African public, though except among her living descendants, of which there are many. However, she appears frequently in anecdotal fashion within published histories on the early VOC Cape as an exceptional figure of the period, as a landowner, an entrepreneur whose children would marry into Cape European society. And stitching these pieces of her life together in combination with primary archival research, I created the performative walking tour following Ansla Bengalen in 2016, a speculative history in which I explored her unstable relations to power that complicate ideas concerning self-determination and implication, cognizant that her story and her family's ascending social mobility in the 17th and 18th centuries runs parallel to the early years of Dutch settlement at the Cape. And the audacious thrust of this intellectual pursuit is the opportunity to explore the generative possibilities of Krotoa and Ansla's imagined shared space, their witnessing of and participation in the rapidly changing circumstances of the self-contained, precarious environment of the early VOC settlement, located disruptively in the middle of a long-established Khoi grazing route, posing a direct and existential affront to their existence. And reflecting upon this critical juncture in South African history, I would like to draw possible correlations and distinctions between myth-making as revisionist historical propaganda and the work of speculation, fiction, and artistic interpretation as a feminist tool for the recuperation, however incomplete, of lost histories and unrecorded experiences. I'm compelled to ask these questions of the speculative dynamics of the fort as a way of wondering, how did people survive the period of slavery? Or what were the social conditions in which they did or did not survive? Learning for the first time about Ansla's story, I made the connection between Ansla and Krotoa's shared inhabitants at the fort, seeing that, according to my research, their lives had never been placed directly alongside one another in the literature. In realizing Ansla's proximity to Krotoa, Ansla became more real to me. The shape of her life came into sharper focus, and the stakes of their living were made all the more tangible. Ansla was no longer a singularly anecdotal figure, but rather something of a fully formed woman living alongside, or at least in near proximity to, another woman made marginal by the environment. Ansla's challenges, while not approximate to Krotoa's, could be contextualized within a more complex system of political domination. And in situating her life next to Krotoa's, I wanted to believe that maybe Ansla was not so alone. And in exposing my personal role as a researcher, I catch myself committing the error of projection. Saadia Hartman asks us why we tell stories and to what ends. Now, operating within the role of narrator, I contend with the ethics of the storytelling, the shaping and contorting of these fragments of truth until they resemble the accepted judgments of history writing, as Abram states. So let us return to Ansla and Krotoa's timeline and what I would argue may have been a particularly crucial period in their lives. Their paths would have first crossed in 1657 when Ansla arrived at the Cape on the ship Amersfoort, captained by Pieter Kemp. Slavery was not yet sanctioned by the VOC, but a number of officials obtained enslaved people for their personal use. Ansla was in this manner sold from Pieter Kemp to Jan van Riebeeck, and according to the estimates of her birth date, she was around 11 years old. By this time, some 5 years into van Riebeeck's role as commander at the Cape, Krotoa had had extensive engagement with the VOC, although she herself was only likely 15 or 16. According to V.C. Malherbe, Krotoa began working for the Van Riebeecks as a young girl, possibly at around the age of 10. Van Riebeeck's wife, a French Huguenot woman named Maria de la Quererie, had recently given birth, and Krotoa was brought into the household to help care for the new baby as a diplomatic arrangement between the VOC and the Khoi. This account, however, is challenged by Yvette Abrams, who suggests that Krotoa may have been kidnapped in 1652 in a skirmish on the Salt River and remained at the fort until 1653, rescued by her clan following a murder by a VOC, the murder of a VOC employee by the Khoi, the first recorded murder by the Khoi that century. The fort was an unusual and singular structure of its kind in the Cape landscape, a lone symbol of Van Riebeeck's vision of colonial strength, who at this time, against the Khoi, who at this time were significantly more powerful than the European settlers. The VOC's presence was thus a threatened one, and the fort building itself was vulnerable to the harsh Cape elements and was in constant need of repair. Slaves, Van Riebeeck contended, were needed to grow the settlement, and the VOC's Heeren 17 refused his numerous requests until 1658 and prohibited the enslavement of the Khoi, who refused to work for the VOC. Ansla was one of a handful of people enslaved at the fort until a large group of around 174 enslaved people arrived on the Amersfoort in 1658. Their presence in the Cape was clandestine, as the Amersfoort had pirated a slave ship en route from Angola to Brazil. The 174 people who arrived were part of an original group of 250, and the majority of the survivors were either young children or ill, which Van Riebeeck lamented as a great inconvenience to his plans. And shortly after the arrival of the Angolan enslaved people, a number of them deserted the settlement. Accused of collusion in the freeing of the enslaved, the Dutch kidnapped Ochumato, Krotoa's uncle, and initially the primary interlocutor between the VOC and the Khoi, who would be held hostage at the fort for over a year. In this period, Krotoa had since returned to work at the fort as a diplomatic envoy and was involved in high-stakes negotiations directly with Van Riebeeck and others concerning the VOC's growing settlement and permanence in the valley, and is described by Malherbe as a cultural broker during the hostage crisis, working across vastly divergent epistemic paradigms. And while Krotoa is recorded in reported speech, Ansla's record goes dark. Ansla was formerly enslaved and had no real legal standing, while Krotoa was still technically free. The status was complicated, as her clan's existence was contingent on the success of her negotiations, and her continued engagement with them meant that she was more and more vulnerable to the nature of the VOC's power dynamics. And as we recall, Krotoa had had close and extended contact with the Van Riebeeck family and others since childhood. All the while, Ansla and the other household slaves were maintaining the interior Dutch life of the fort in direct service to Van Riebeeck and other VOC officials and employees. And also, although silent in the record, she was presumably privy to the intricacies of these cataclysmic social changes surrounding the settlement, whilst adhering to the expectations of an enslaved woman. And employing the tools of critical fabulation, I imagine Krotoa's frequent and noted presence in the fort, that she was known to everyone who resided there. And rather cinematically, I imagine that Ansla may have worked wordlessly in the background during heated negotiations for Ochumato's release, ignored by Van Riebeeck in life, just as she was in his logbooks. And it is tempting to imagine that Ansla and Krotoa exchanged words or knowing glances as they passed one another in the doorway or in the courtyard. As Krotoa publicly bartered her knowledge, perhaps Ansla was gathering information of her own, plotting her next movements, the ideal course of action under the circumstances. The number of enslaved people, their living conditions, and their roles were likely of great importance to Krotoa and the Khoi, and proof of the horror that could befall them should things go badly. And the arrival of the 174 Angolan enslaved, as we know now, escalated the VOC-Khoi conflict, and following the VOC's approval, a steady stream of slave ships would soon arrive. From 1658, Robert Schell estimates that some 60,000 enslaved people would be brought to the Cape, forever changing the social dynamics of the settlement, and indeed, South Africa. I wonder how Ansla and Krotoa personally negotiated their shared knowledge of others in bondage and of those who managed to run away, while they were both so entangled in the affairs of the VOC. These existential, life-altering events happened in rapid succession, producing shifting points of reorientation. In caring for the Van Riebeeck children, and in proximity to the young captured enslaved children from Angola, they undoubtedly had first-hand experiences of the discrepancies in the value of life. Did their own pregnancies and the birth of their own children in this environment produce more acute negotiation with living and survival? What plans and decisions would need to be made to ensure a life made livable, to echo the words of Macharia. Ansla herself would have 3 children born and freed from slavery, and 4 children inducted into European society as a result of her marriage to Dutchman Arnoldus Willems Besson in 1669. The conflicting accounts of her children's parentage, fodder for genealogists, both obscure the troubling possibilities of how such children may have been conceived and diminish Ansla's personal calculations in the navigation of her situation. Krotoa would also marry a European associated with the company, a Danish surgeon named Pieter van Meerhof in 1664, noted as the first Christian interracial marriage at the Cape of Good Hope. Their relationship produced 3 children, 2 born prior to their marriage and 1 following it. And when Yvette Abramse asks whether Eva was raped, note that she does not specify by who, she speaks to the vulnerability of Krotoa in the fort, but equally the recognized use of rape as a colonial tool for subjugation and control. Rape, as theorized by Pumla Dineo-Qola and Habiba Badaroon and others, is described as being bound up with the practice of colonialism, a mechanism that exerts and enacts domination upon those rendered most vulnerable. And regarding slavery, Zoe Wickham has written about the manner in which sexual violence under these conditions and the progeny slavery produces, reproduces and maintains generational shame in its descendants. I would also raise the subject of rape and sexual violence in this context in relation to the limited recognition of family formations under Cape slavery. VOC policy actively disrupted biological family formations in favor of what Stoller has called the creation of white prestige. And by means of sexual violence or otherwise, sexual relations between enslaved women and free men, primarily European, produced the creation of shadow families as described by Hortense Spillers. These families, racialized by other as not human, sustained the primary official slave-owning family. The shadow families were and are disavowed despite shared surnames and family names. And in South Africa, as a result of the sustained intergenerational familial rejection, Wickham has described a near absent slave folklore in the slave descendant imagination. And noting this and the complexities of the free-unfree dichotomy, historians such as Anna Busekin have noted the sustained relationships Ansla maintained in her life as a free woman, following her manumission in 1666. Notably, the most famous of her daughters would go on to marry Olaf Berg and inherit the estate Groot Constantia, and as a result herself would inherit a great many enslaved people who resided on the property. In 2016, I asked the following questions in the speculative walking tour following Ansla van Bengalen. Understanding this, we are then left to question how Ansla's children were accepted or engaged with during this time, particularly as the children of a freed slave. And I wonder about the ways in which her family flouted or confirmed the delineations of race and class during this very hierarchized period in Cape slave history. And as it pertains to Krotoa's life, Abrams asks us to trouble what has been frequently described as a life lived between cultures. And in the literature, much is made of the donning and casting off of European and Khoi attire as symbolic of this cultural tension. Her eventual reliance on alcohol and the removal of her children from her care is moralized in the historiography as a sign of her poor state of mind and social alienation from both groups. And I, like Abrams, would argue that these circumstances instead reveal to us something far more complex, a response to the catastrophe of her environment. As witnesses and participants in the changing landscape of this new society, I'm curious about the impact of these quickly shifting circumstances on the women's psychologies. For Krotoa, as a woman who was born and had lived in the Cape all her life, and for Ansla, a woman with the living memory of her home, culture, and the Indian Ocean's Middle Passage. And I remain curious about Croteau and Ansler's decisions about their allegiances, their capacities to have hope for better lives for their children, and the difficult, seemingly contradictory positioning of their lives in proximity to colonial power. And in this vein, I problematize the questions of agency and resistance to make space for, as Alexander Huelea has described as, quote, minuscule movements, glimmers of hope, scraps of food, the interrupted dreams of freedom found in those spaces seem devoid of full human life, end quote. Hartman tells us that in trying to represent what we cannot, we further expose the individuals of history to risk, to harm. And worse, if we attempt to devise some fable from these fragmented historical narratives, we belabor the dead and their legacies to our own ends. Hartman's conception of critical fabulation entails the re-examination of the information one does have and reassessing the hierarchies of this knowledge from the perspective of the present, drawing together sources and ideas to loop the strands left open by absence, silence, non-reportage. But to loop the strands should not be an attempt to find complete resolution. It is this attitude of something to be gained that turns historical figures into national symbols, that overdetermines their life stories and forecloses meaning. And in a post-democratic South Africa, where slave history is either unaccommodated in the national narrative or mythologized to political ends, I wonder what it would mean to make peace with incommensurability and allow the dead their right to rest. Thank you.
It's quite opportune that that Amie leaves that quote from Alexander on the screen, and we emerged this, we put this together around the question of the Earth Archive for a particular reason as well, by also thinking about the number of lives that are ensconced in the archives of the Ethnographic institution, and what might be at stake in thinking those archives, what kind of responsibility or ethics. It has always fascinated me that there are so many unnamed, unknown, photographed in our archives. And what does speculative possibilities afford us? What does fabulation afford us? Or what is the limits of the possibility of fabulation? And who has the right to fabulate? I'd like to think of the work of the artist Matilda Zheng, who has this particular project called Woman Must Go, I think. It's what collection that we have, where she works with the images of unknown women in collections. What are the potentialities but also the problems of that kind of work? We'll know here in my auntie for 20 minutes. And it's kind of easy when somebody records it, and it's really 20 minutes. Eh? So that's what will happen.
Guardianship. I think the more I read the Dalai's text, the more I'm, we're really, I started with we're the 0.01%. Right? Are we the guardian as the 0.01%? I mean, so I think just personally, that's just my personal position. So the second one, the inside-outside, precisely, that to me is perhaps something actually feasible for institutions to start with. I mean, we can debate about this. I think it's very difficult, probably, I'm not an institution, I'm not a curator in an institution, but artists who are invited to institutions to push the institutions a bit. I think, to me, of course, this whole idea of conserving things for perpetuity is completely crazy. right? Nothing on this planet should be conserved for eternity, right? So, but of course, this, institutions like this are completely based on this idea, at least, also in our world, ownership and collection and these things, of course. But I think perhaps to me, based on what I've done so far and also talking to many people learning from institutions, perhaps this idea of at least starting to think about the fluidity of space is possible. If we cannot go directly from conserving things to completely, putting objects into their original setting, at least we can create the spectrum of spaces perhaps in institutions. That's, to me, is very feasible. So I think there are things we could start with right away. Yes, thank you for the example.
I'd love to come back to hear all of the other things you want to change, but we'll do that later on. And I can assure you that your question about perpetuity, there are a few conservators in the audience who are okay with decay. They think decay is fine as well. Nick at the back.
Well, thanks. I'm Nick Thomas from Cambridge, very privileged to be one of the partners of this project and network that has, I think, so much unfinished business. I wanted to thank Claudia and Wayne and everyone else who's enabled us to come together, which is not something we take for granted quite in the same way. And I thought those three presentations were really inspiring. And I was inspired particularly by the Gropius bough wood on the car park. But I just wanted to mention that there used to be a building on that car park, and the institution in the building was the Museum for Volkerkunde. So there's a sort of ghost of a museum there. And Wayne alluded to the sort of, not so much parallel, but deeply intertwined history of ethnographic museums and botanic gardens, intertwined histories of botany and ethnography and collecting, and many of our collections were made by people who also collected plants, and they collected plants and cultural forms from the same people often. I guess I think quite often about the fact that the botanic garden seems easily redeemable. I think many people who walk through botanic gardens find them sort of spaces of peace, beauty, well-being. Maybe all that hinges on amnesia of a certain kind. But I also wonder if, I guess I wonder about the impossibility of us thinking in a comparably straightforward way about these sorts of museums, which I very much agree with Wayne are more important than they ever have been, despite all the issues we're very much aware of. So is it simply impossible to imagine these institutions as spaces of peace, well-being, and so on? Or can we think of some imperfect and temporary ways in which we could make them sometimes feel like that?
And the question is not for you to have the final answer, but a speculation towards an answer.
I've worked with botanical garden. I think the issue is precisely the other way around, I think, in my experience. How to make the botanical garden interested in, politics, interested in colonial issues, etc. Often people, like you said, often people go there, they just want to see beautiful nature. But I think if, as artists or as cultural workers, if we really want to connect nature, culture, connect these institutions, so I see two things, right? One here, how do we become more than human? But actually in the botanical garden, how do we become more than biological? How do we bring the politics and complex histories into that space? So there's, I completely agree with what Lena, you said. Very concretely, these institutions really, to me, I think these institutions have so much to work together on. Yeah.
All right. Amie, you have I have a question precisely for you, but you have a speculation about...
Not so much a speculation, but a kind of a linking between our projects and our research areas, and in relation to the previous question. So Cape Town is home to one of the world's most celebrated botanical gardens, and is a site of incredible biodiversity, and a very specific indigenous biome called fynbos, which the indigenous groups of the area have incredible knowledge of. And the site in which Cape Town's very celebrated botanical gardens is also the site of Jan van Riebeeck's bitter almond hedges, which he planted in the 17th century as a way to protect his terrain from the indigenous people, but also to prevent cattle from leaving his demarcated area. And today, I think what is really fascinating about a place like Cape Town, which is obviously a site of so much violence, is that it is so frequently understood and enjoyed as a place of a kind of paradise, because of its beauty, because of its natural landscape, the mountain, the sea, the ocean. And it is kind of like a playground now for wealthy people, and it is increasingly gentrified as a desirable place to live because of this beautiful lifestyle that one can have. And nature in this context is a foil, or I read as a foil for violence. Nature is a way in which people can have a nice time and enjoy being outside without having to worry about politics or history. And so this turn, or the possibility of reading the landscape in this way, which is very interesting to me in other aspects of my work, is also a site of political erasure. And there are some very interesting people working in this area. Someone worth looking at would be the work of someone like Zayan Khan, who is really looking at a reconnection with indigenous and forgotten methods of working with things like fermentation and food practices and preservation, as a way of reconnecting with the landscape in a more holistic way. So, yes.
I want to hold, yes, the mic will come. I want to hold together what you're being saying, because Nick, in an interesting way, I've always thought, if one were to try to find, and this is some work that I did a long time ago, if one were to try to find the life worlds, the creative worlds of the enslaved in Jamaica, one would have to go to the ethnobotanical department at Kew Gardens to find that. Because in the Ethnographic Museum would be the Tainos, who are presumed to be dead. And then you have the natural history in the Natural Museum. And in the ethnobotany is where you find bamboo specimens and this specimen and that specimen of a people that were not really regarded as ethnographic enough, but not artistic enough. So that botanical garden becomes significant in telling stories that we don't tell in a certain sense. So I think that there's something that ties them nicely together. But if one were to read the works of people involved in multi-species ethnography, then one realized that there's a lot about preservation there and killing, but also in Jamaica, when I worked at the museum, we would always talk about invasive species. And I love the term invasive species because I always thought the Tainos might be saying that of me. But we use that term as a term to try and say who belongs and who doesn't belong. So even that is an overlap between the categories that we use. My auntie, are you hearing us? Yes? Okay, but we're not hearing you yet. So are you seeing us, kind of? She sees as well, but there's no sound yet. The question of the more than human in relationship to religion, for a museum like ours where religion is such an embedded category of formation, of thinking, can this museum offer a space, Nick said, of peace, ease, of a space for critical rethinking of multi-species possibilities? Can the museum be that site where publics be educated into that? And what do you think would be how could that work? So think about it, and we're fixing the sound. Question.
Okay. Thank you for the presentations. This question is specifically for Amie. As you were speaking, I was thinking about this kind of process of, I guess, recovering aspects of a past that at times can be unrecoverable. And I was also thinking about how sometimes this forces us, or I guess it forces us to rethink the role of a historian, and also some of the tensions between myth-making and speculation, between power and agency, and this kind of mapping of a counter-historical memory or narrative. And I was thinking about that in relation to positionality. You spoke about this navigating between kind of like projecting and narrating, and I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more about how you position yourself, and also, I guess, how that might shape the ways in which you're speculating, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Are we taking a round of questions, or?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, that's a very good point. And in preparation for this conference, I debated how and if to position myself in relationship to the work, because for me it's incredibly personal. And my sense of kinship with the people that I am ostensibly researching is a way for me to find connection with a history and a past that is so unclear to me. I'm from Cape Town. I grew up there, was educated there, at least for my undergrad. And engaging with these histories was a way for me to understand slavery as a descendant of enslaved people. And through perhaps not having a clear entry point into my own family, I developed these strange relationships with these women, and in some ways became rather obsessed with them, in a way that it was knowing more about them, trying to understand what their lives were like, was driving my research. And so in this sort of like frenzied type of way, trying to gather as much information as I can in order to understand how South Africans and slave descendant groups can make sense of their histories, but also make sense of where we are now. The questions around gender and South Africa's gendered and sexualized violence crisis is also very linked to these early histories, and that is also not frequently acknowledged or understood as its own kind of genealogy of violence. And so this is, it's a deeply, deeply personal project, and in that way, this intention and this pursuit really inflects to the nature of my research, just as it does for Saadia Hartman and just as it does for Yvette Abrams. And so therefore it's also important for me to be engaging with other scholars who are negotiating this relationship with the role of the researcher and the role of the historian in similar ways. Obviously from different contexts, the United States and South Africa being very, very different slave societies as well. But in understanding and breaking down this so-called objectivity that one might have or one might assume as we talk about history.
I want to try to bring my auntie in, and I see, Juno, you have a question. All right, so I'm going to do these 3 questions now. One of the things I like to think about just going forward, just to keep it on the agenda, is how do we involve ourselves in a certain kind of multi-species, more than human kinship, without reproducing certain dominant positionalities over. So I'm interested in that, and I think that ties to something. And for you, Amie, I would be interested in what forms of positionality do we adopt in relationship to the immensity of the unknown persons in our archives. And that is from the many hundreds of thousands of images that we have of people we don't know, to the ancestral remains that we have in our collections, many of our museums. So how do we come to terms with that in terms of what you would describe as the speculative, the fabulative possibilities? My auntie, are you hearing now? Can you say something?
I am.
Yay, we can.
Technology works. And sorry to have you up so early in the morning. Yeah.
And I'm sorry that I can't, that I'm not there in person. It's also very early for me, so I'm going to try to think about this question. And one of the things I've really been struck by with regard to the museum, just doing, I'm not there, but I've just been doing a little bit of research, is the liveliness of the space and the liveliness of some of the conversations that you're having, which in some ways, strikes me as kind of, when I think of museums, I don't necessarily think of aliveness and liveliness. So already I think there's something really interesting happening there. And as my paper is trying to think with, I'm really interested in what I'm calling minor traditions within these broader religious discourses and religious traditions, and forms of buried knowledge, or even kind of subterranean knowledge, subterranean moments, subterranean traditions, and the kind of small animals in this amazing epistle that I mentioned in the book, the case of the animals versus man in the court of the jinn. The parrot who's speaking, the nightingale who's speaking, the ant, these sort of tiny creatures. And so I think for me, the focus is on the smallness of these life forms, our own smallness, the smallness of some of the objects that you have in the museum, the smallness of the conversations. And I think there's, I think for me at least, I don't want to go big. I think that's where we have made a mistake in some sense. And so for me, what you asked, Wayne, what the museum could do and could be, and I think for me, it's the site of these possible multitude of small conversations that don't have necessarily a bigger end other than perhaps the moment itself. I don't know if I'm making sense because, like I said, it's really early. But that's what your question spurred me to start thinking with. And I think, we've been having conversations kind of about the Anthropocene as this kind of massive thing, and I want to kind of attend to the minute and attend to the small, not as a way out, not as a kind of apolitical stance, but precisely as the place in which politics must begin to take place.
Yeah, I mean, there is something about that. Yesterday we had a conversation around restitution for 2 days, and one of the scholars, a young scholar, she was saying how overwhelmed she felt because the change needed to be inaugurated, which is not about decolonizing the museum, but about decolonizing the world, was so big. And how do you participate in small acts that contribute to that bigger act was kind of the question. We'll come back to that, my auntie. Juna first, and then Miriam, and then Peter. So this line. Or is your question really tied to one of the questions and you want to start? No, it's all right, Juna.
This was super fascinating, and the pairing is, thank you so much for these fantastic papers, but I was struck, Amy's paper is making me think about Beau's paper, and Beau's paper is making me think about my auntie's paper. So, Amie, the image of the film stills that you use, to me, they are just completely terrifying, especially the first film of Kratoa as a child. And it seems like an aestheticization of sexual and racialized violence. And it's made aesthetically pleasing, and that's very terrifying to me. So I was curious if you could speculate more of what is the attraction to that, the cinematic attraction to that. And Beau, thinking about this delightful ecosexual film, having seen Amy's presentation, it makes me wonder, where do you draw the line between sharing pleasure, interspecies pleasure, versus imposing touch? And then, my auntie, this is, I was struck by the way that you're using science, and specifically the animal sensoria, and then you work against it. So it's on one hand, you're using the authority of science, and on the other hand, you're saying something else. But a lot of the paper is actually about the authority of science. So I'm wondering, especially when this kind of authority of science, it can be it can be ableist, right? Because not you, but any kind of ethological explanation of an animal has one singular prototype of an animal in mind. And so it really does any diversity away. Sorry, I'm not articulate because I'm not having slept enough. But more than that, I'm just worried about the reliance on scientific authority, especially when you want to end with negative zoology and recognize the authority of other kinds of worlds that are dismissed by the same scientific authority that you just used in a moment. So a lot of it is about the ambivalence of how do we deal with the authority of science while not subscribing to the secularisms of that science. Okay, thank you.
All right, and perhaps it might be good, because you asked 3 questions, to let them answer, otherwise you'd be confused. Can I start with my auntie, just because you came in a little later, yeah? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah.
Was that Juno's question?
Yes, that was Juno's question.
Hi, Juno. I'm sorry I can't be there. I think I understood most of it. How do we kind of both, or what do we do with scientific authority? And yeah, I mean, I definitely struggle with this, and I'm struggling with it as I write the book. What I'm finding, though, is that scientific authority itself is not one in some sense, right? I mean, this, this, and so what I've been kind of struck by are the moments in which scientists just have no idea, right? And that's what for me what was really fascinating about dogs' capacity for magnetoreception, is that we know that they have it, we just don't know what it is, and we may in some ways never know. And so I think I hear your concern, and I have the same concern, and And I think that's partly why I'm trying to write with both, in a sense, and then take the science part in places that science probably wouldn't want to go. Because I think to sort of make a clean break between, you know, sort of science and not science is not how I want to do this. But I also don't want to present a kind of, you know, religious traditions that are then backed by scientific authority, which I think is your concern, which I think is a really relevant and powerful one. So I'm still honestly struggling with this, and I'm curious to hear how others are dealing with this. I'm not a kind of science scholar the way that some of you are. This is totally not my bag. I just, you know, read a bunch of books about dogs. And so, you know, and I was just like, oh wow, they have all of these, they can do all these things, and we have no idea, and nobody seems to really have any idea. So, key for me is staying with an individual animal, so to speak, and kind of working through my relationship with a particular dog, and kind of thinking about what happens when I touch the dog or the dog touches me. And so kind of, for me, at least one way to write against the overwhelmingness of scientific authority is precisely to go into those smaller moments.
Now, it's interesting because this was a long discussion over 2 days before, because when we think of scientific authority within the context of the museum, it is not only in relationship to non-human animals, but it is also, in our context, also the relationship between the museum as a scientific institution and all of the indigenous knowledges that we have that is regarded as non-scientific, or how we regard that. So that has also been the battle space we've been in. And just to say to you, my auntie, I'm very close to someone who is working on dogs, and the fact that dogs are actually participate in racialized equality, that you teach dogs to be racist. So interesting as well. Bo.
So the question is, when does the question is mutual pleasure versus imposing touch in the Guy and Fern situation. Two thoughts. I mean, they're not answers. So two thoughts. One is in Dao De Jing, the Taoist text, it says, when we lose Tao, we turn to ethics. That's one. Two, I always think, I'm not a scholar or a legal scholar, etc. You think about situation a lot. I always think, for me, I think better if I'm in a forest or I'm swimming next to a reef. All right.
In response to this can perhaps answer both of your questions. In relation to the film, which I did not pass any judgments on in my presentation, I shall now. Not all, as I'm kind of advocating for kind of poetic responses and artistic responses to history, me also being a trained artist, and I'm not a historian, I'm not an archivist, I just have a very deep attachment and interest in these subjects. And as a result, my methodologies are sometimes unusual. But not all artistic interpretations of history are ethical or good. And in this particular instance of this film, it really propagates some very dangerous ideas about what kinship can look like historically. And in the film, if you care to watch it, it's a very troubling representation of what that relationship may have been. And I think the important intervention of Yvette Abrams, in this context, she wrote the article was Efa Raped, an exercise in speculative history in 1996. And so these ideas have been kind of circulating within a particular part of the South African Historical Academy for like quite some time now, long before Sadia Hartman's Venus Interacts. And I think what she asks of us is a way to engage with these histories as ethically as we can, attending to the power dynamics that were present at that time. And in that way, even her assertions in that paper are propositions, they are suggestions, they are ideas, and are not to be taken as fact. And I think about that also in terms of all of the many people accounted for in this institution, as they are in all institutions. South Africa also has a model of the colonial museum that is not different in many ways from European institutions. We also have national institutions that are dealing with issues of sacred objects, human remains, that are, and those power dynamics are much the same, as I've said. And so in thinking about how we respond to these faceless, nameless, unnamed individuals, I think it is really important to, and obviously I don't have the answers, think about affective and poetic registers of response that are nonetheless attendant to the questions of ethics. In that, even a photograph, I was involved in a project, Black Chronicles, curated by René Masai a number of years ago. And in that exhibition, there were a number of portraits from the late 19th century of all sorts of people who sat for photographs in photographic studios in London. And this exhibition was a really interesting case in that some people were named and some people weren't. But what was really fascinating about the experience of seeing those images was the human connection that people made with the people in the photographs, because they were almost life-size. And so people felt almost as though it was sort of like looking into a mirror. The sense of scale and the sense of like immediacy and liveness was so present in that show. And it was so affecting for people who were there. I think there's something there. I obviously can't speak more on what could be done in this moment, but I think there's something about, in that same way, and when we look into the archive and we read the anecdotal, that connection that we feel with people in a few lines, I think that is the hook that is interesting to me. Yeah.
I mean, there is some, these two questions we're going to take, there is something troubling in that, because there are many historians who find Sadia Hartman's speculation very difficult, because it is not factual enough, right? So, but I'm also interested to tie to another fellow we work with, to Ariel Azule's potential histories, to think through the what-ifness, because there is a what-ifness to many of these archives. What we use in our project, we're trying to start about histories that never became, because they were suppressed or whatever, revolutions that could have led to something else. But these are things that I think the archives open up, or as Karine would say, the unarchives might open up.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So I think I follow on that. Thank you. The papers were absolutely fabulous. I loved them all. So I'm going to start with a question for Mayanthi, and then it'll open up to Amie and Bo. Mayanthi, hi, it's Miriam. I'm sorry you're not here. I love this idea of the human as an onto-epistemological limit, and I thought what you did with that was really great. I just wanted to question this idea of where you ended on radical difference and unbridgeable gaps, because it seems like everything you laid out was not about radical difference, but partial incommensurabilities. Because you talk about the cat looking at a blank wall, so we know there's something there. We know dogs can sense magnetic fields. We know them, we don't know how, we don't know what. But so there's a partial commensurability as opposed to a radical difference. And I wonder if there's something we can do with these partial commensurabilities. In particular, we sense that there's a lack of knowledge. We know that it's only partially commensurable. What can we do with the sense of a lack of knowledge? So to me, that goes back to kind of the speculative and the critical fabulation that Amie brought up, and also to the different sensory regimes that Bo was talking about. And I wonder if there's a way to include partial commensurabilities in museums. Like, is there a space for the lack of knowledge? And how do we materialize that then in these gaps? So my question then would be for all of you about that.
My auntie.
Thanks, Miriam. Hi. It's nice to hear you. Thank you for that question. And yeah, you're right. And I'm still kind of thinking through some of this. I think you're right that the positing of radical difference is too strong. And I think what I was trying to do, I was kind of writing against, some of the literature that I've been reading that ends with, we're all animals, right? There's a kind of there's a way in which similitude becomes the basis for any kind of multi-species kinship, and so I was, I think, writing perhaps too strongly against that. And I really like what you say about partial incommensurability, and you said there's a sense of a lack of knowledge, and that can lead to a kind of critical fabulation, and I think that's absolutely right. And actually, I want to pause on the term and concept of sense, right? Like, there's a sense of a lack of knowledge, and I think what's happening here is, in that sense of a lack of knowledge, there's the mobilization of a set of senses that we are not used to using as secular moderns, or don't have a kind of, we don't let flourish in the same way. And so I want to think a little bit more with this question, because I think it's actually really, it's key to another part of what I'm writing in the book, which is precisely on the senses, and senses beyond the kind of traditional five, and senses, and even senses like touch and smell, and these other sort of non-visual, non-oral senses that I think are constantly mobilized in our interactions with our non-human kin, but I think go submerged in some sense in the way that we move in the world. So I think that is precisely the point of a kind of critical fabulation and a kind of speculative realism that I'm trying to work with. So thank you for that question, because it's actually incredibly productive.
Yeah, Bo or Amie, quickly, and then we can.
Yeah, so I try to say sense rather than to know, and I don't say knowledge, I say wisdom. And the question you asked, how to bring, how do we create the experience of sensing things? We'll just invite artists.
Okay, good. Amie?
Thank you also for that question. I think it's really, really helpful in a lot of ways, particularly because in trying to grapple with partial histories, we're also working with a great amount of information, a great volume of information that can tell us all sorts of other things about the conditions of a place. And I think it's really, and this is where, as Wayne has said, fabulation moves into, or speculation moves into very dangerous territory, where the imagining then becomes a kind of, could be interpreted as a kind of truth in a particular context. And And to my mind, that can only be countered by a kind of plurality in having as many imaginings of a particular kind of partial commensurability. And again, in trying to flatten this distinction between storyteller, historian, narrative, fiction. And particularly, I think, in a South African context as well, where there are not many fictional interpretations of historical events, and so then that piece of fiction comes to stand in for a history experience. And so both can do as much harm. A novel can do as much harm as a piece of, as a historical account. And perhaps fiction is perhaps more dangerous in that way, in that it is more seductive. Yeah.
I want to thank you. I want to move to Peter now, and to say that one of the things I learned from Claudia, who spoke earlier, is also the museum's drive to know. We always need to know, and therefore we need to scan things and go into things that we should know about, but we would need to know it anyway. So there are power packets that we should know, but we think the visitor needs to know, therefore we're going to find out what is in it to tell them. And the question then is, how do we give in to a possibility of, you don't need to know it, it's not for you to know? And is that possible as an exhibitionary, an ethical strategy, as a caring strategy? And Bo, there's a nice thing by Tim Ingold where he also balances between wisdom and knowledge, and the anthropology as wisdom. And there's a beautiful work by David Graeber just before he died, where he was writing against, no, not against, in response to the ontological turn, where he critiques this idea of incommensurability, or at least troubles it, and what that might look like. He was writing in relationship to Vivero Castro and a critique of him. Generous thing, I can send it around. Peter.
Thank you all for these amazing papers. I think it's more of an observation than a real question, but it was triggered by the repeated use by Bo of the word composting. I've just finished writing a book on material culture, and the word composting comes back time and again, although it is mostly about how people relate to apparently dead objects. And what strikes me about that is that in reviewing the literature on material culture, one of the things that is really baffling at times is the extent to which the people who wrote about it and brought it back, as it were, in the limelight, including the museum into that in the 1980s, rarely use what you could call organic language. It's about subjects and objects. It's about artifacts. And one of the things that I try to say in the book, but what about the fact that what we do with things, whether they are alive or less alive, what do we do with the fact that we relate to those things as organisms? As it's as Pierre Bourdieu would have said, it's a dialectic of embodiment and objectification, and it goes on all the time, which means that the relationship itself has an irreducible organic component, so to speak. So that's why I use the word composting, because that's my way of talking about history. And this also relates very much to some of the things that Mayanti was just talking about, also, especially also in your response to questions. Namely, that sense of smallness that you get when you know you are in the presence of a history that has, I would call it, being composted into our everyday life, but in ways that we can't oversee, that our sensory capacities cannot, you know, encompass, that we're simply too small for to see. And I think that is, well, there are so many resonances in the discussion just now, but I feel it even is, you know, it says something about the situation that Amie was trying to make us understand, but I don't dare to go there at this point. But I feel that might be a small step that we could make as scholars, as artists, by reconsidering language and talking about ourselves as being animals, engaging with other animals or engaging with things that also are alive, but they decay perhaps much slower. And in any case, as the word composting, I think, very well illustrate, they have ingredients that enter into reactions with each other in quite remarkable ways.
We have time for, I don't know if you want to respond. He said it wasn't a question. So, well, that's all right. I mean, I take away about also the conceptual tools that we use to be able to describe the work that we do. And what is at stake in that, I'm convinced that a part of the museum's struggle is with the concepts that it mobilizes to be able to address the world around it. One last question and then we can stop, right? It's fine? Yeah, or we can do two. And then we can have my auntie go back to bed because it's really early for her there.
I'm up for good. I'm staying up. I can sit here for another hour.
Okay, all right. Well, we have 15 more minutes then and you're all going to stay because...
Okay. Well, I have just one comment. I think a lot of you know that more than 50% of the DNA of the human body is not human, yeah? And so I think we are embodying a kind of multi-species relationship, yeah? And I'm very glad that today we talked also about plants, because normally when we talk about interspecies relationship, it's focusing more on animals, yeah? And plants are in the hierarchy still very on the ground, yeah? And I don't want to blame anybody for what people are eating, but when you are eating plants, you are also eating beings, yeah, which are alive, yeah, and in a way you kill them, yeah. So I think that this is very important to keep the plants in mind, because we talked about this in other workshops in the Taking Care project already, that we cannot really understand the objects we have in our storages if we don't know what plants are they made from. And in Cambridge, we talked about that now some trees became persons, I think in Australia and in New Zealand. What does this mean for our objects in our storage? Yeah? It will become more complicated than before, but I think also more interesting.
All right. I mean, it is the analytical yield of thinking the Ethnographic Museum, which is actually where this project came from as well, was to say that it has been subject to the regiment of the ethnographic for a long time in a particular way, without thinking that a vast amount of the collection is both animal and plants in the collection. So we never think of what that might mean. The amount of feather, birds, all of that is there, and the question is what potentialities that hold, and even as I say that it feels extractive, what potentialities. Questions. I'm not good with silence, as you will know, so please, question. I was just going to call on Wanwu because my auntie, I want to ask a question which is probably a problematic one, but I ask it notwithstanding. Because you are reading as well around the question of the religious, right? And you are bringing that to different, thinking it differently by thinking it in the more than human. One of the things that animate our work here anyway is how we as institutions, as ethnographic institutions, deal with religion and what is at stake with dealing with religion. Now, one of the things that we were talking about recently is that for the Ethnographic Museum, there are certain religions that are ethnographic: Buddhism, Islam. Those are ethnographic. Christianity isn't really ethnographic. Christianity is European, they say. But I'm interested in the fact that religion becomes one of the hot sites for thinking about political exclusion or inclusion in Europe today, for thinking about questions of belonging, questions of the human, questions of race. And I wonder, what might your smaller reading do for us as we think about religion within the contemporary political discourse, where religion animates itself as actually one of the anxieties of our current moment? So what is there a yield to be gained by thinking through the lens that you offer for thinking religion in its political discourse as a practice of violent exclusion, unbelonging, whatever?
I mean, that's a huge question. Thank you, Wei. I have lots of thoughts, and I think this is going to be a bit disconnected, but the first thing I would say, just, and for those of you who don't know, my first book was on Islam and secularism in France and Europe more generally. I don't know if it's necessarily religion that is animating Europe so much as Islam, right? And Christianity kind of as the subtext. And so I think it's important that we not continue to collapse the Islamic and the religious precisely in Europe. And so for me, it's important as a scholar of Islam to bring Islam back in unexpected ways into this conversation, precisely as a place of ethics and politics. So that's the first thing. I think the other thing that has always been striking to me is just how secular the Academy is. And so I think, again, as a kind of political and ethical act, if we are going to talk about the Anthropocene, if we are going to talk about, the Global South, if we are going to talk about populations that are minoritized and marginalized, then we have to talk about what we're calling religion. Because to do otherwise is precisely to continue to enact the kind of exclusion and kind of epistemic violence that we, good secular modern academics, are attempting to write against and work against. So I think we really have to kind of grapple with that ourselves, our own secularity, and how it is that we associate certain religions with religion itself. The third thing I will say is that grappling has to do with our own, and I really mean that our own as a kind of secular academy, our own Christian history. And that's hard. But I think it's something that we have to do, and I don't think that the answer is simply to go to indigeneity, for instance, which is where the academy has gone, right? Because that's just frankly too easy. And so I think this is a huge question. It's a big question. It's something that I'm grappling with. But I think just kind of to come back to the personal, my own trajectory was from a very explicitly kind of political engagement with Islam in Europe to this much more kind of esoteric project, and I've been trying to think, does this project have a politics? And I think that those three issues that I just outlined, that's where the politics of this project is. And so again, I think maybe that comes finally back to the smallness question, to try to come at this big question of religion and politics, and frankly of Islam in Europe, Islam and the North Atlantic, in these smaller, more unexpected ways.
All right, thank you. And actually, it is a big question, and you gave answers that I was hoping you'd give. So let's continue talking about that. We are then at the close because it seems as if there is no more question. I had hoped for a question from the conservation side of the hall, but that conservation side probably will come. Can conservation be caring? Is it possible to preserve? And should the museum think otherwise about its preservationist narrative to welcome destruction, decay, letting go? Is restitution also an act of care? Degrowth, smaller collections, all of those things animate how we think and are trying to think this project. But this morning, we had started out with the Earth Archive primarily through Catherine Yusuf's work and the questions of the planet. But it has taken us actually from outside the museum to also mine into the museum, to try and think about what it is as an institution and what can it afford to think these multi-species kinships differently. I would be interested to continue this conversation later on, to think through kinship and kinship possibilities, but also kinship in a way that accounts for difference, but also that creates the conditions for future flourishing and how we can come together in creating that. And my imagination, not still, is that the ethnographic museums, with all of its problems, is the site from which we can start to think that, even till the moment. Probably they will be abolished sometime, but that won't happen tomorrow. So, seeing that it won't happen tomorrow, let us do the work to create the conditions for the futures that we want. Thank you. And Bo, are coming back to you to hear about everything we could do differently. All right.